Welcome to Trip Couplet, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Ford, and we are here for another installment of the opening paragraph playlist here on the channel, where we take a little bit of time with the opening paragraph to some piece of literature. And today's video is pretty special for me because this is one of my all-time favorite short stories. It is written by Flannery O'Connor. But first off, guys, if you hit that like button, it really helps me out here on the channel. If you have somehow found your way here without being subscribed and you think literature is something in which you might be interested, consider hitting that subscribe button and sticking around a little bit longer. But again, A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor. We're going to look at the opening paragraph. And the opening paragraph reads as such. The grandmother didn't want to go to Florida. She wanted to visit some of her connections in East Tennessee, and she was seizing at every chance to change Bailey's mind. Bailey was the son she lived with, her only boy. He was sitting on the edge of his chair at the table, bent over the orange sports section of the Journal. "Now look here, Bailey," she said. "See here, read this." And she stood with one hand on her thin hip and the other rattling the newspaper at his bald head. "Here, this fellow that calls himself the Misfit is a loose from the federal pen and headed toward Florida, and you read here what it says he did to these people. Just you read it. I wouldn't take my children in any direction with a criminal like that a loose in it. I couldn't answer to my conscience if I did." Now, we're going to be talking about what it is that we can glean from this opening paragraph. And a lot of what we can glean here is fairly mundane, but there are two very large things that I would like to talk about after we get through some of that more surface level stuff here. So I'm going to read this opening paragraph one more time here. The grandmother didn't want to go to Florida. She wanted to visit some of her connections in East Tennessee, and she was seizing at every chance to change Bailey's mind. Bailey was the son she lived with, her only boy. He was sitting on the edge of his chair at the table, bent over the orange sports section of the Journal. "Now look here, Bailey," she said. "See here, read this." And she stood with one hand on her thin hip and the other rattling the newspaper at his bald head. "Here, this fellow that calls himself the Misfit is a loose from the federal pen and headed toward Florida, and you read here what it says he did to these people. Just you read it. I wouldn't take my children in any direction with a criminal like that a loose in it. I couldn't answer to my conscience if I did." So some of the, let's start with the first sentence. The first sentence, the grandmother didn't want to go to Florida. This tells us just a couple things that are pretty obvious. One, there's a grandmother, and two, there's a Florida, which means there's a going to Florida, which means they're not in Florida. Also, it probably tells us that we're talking about some type of vacation, right? Because we're talking about going someplace like Florida, someplace nice and warm. But we also have in that, on a more meta level, hesitation. Did not want to go to Florida. There's a hesitation there. There is a disconnect with the general direction of the story. And the disconnect from the general direction of a story, a desire to go someplace different from where the story is headed, is often seen in something like a horror story, right? There are so many elements of horror that go often overlooked, but one of the more subtle tells that you're in a story going the wrong direction is that our protagonist does not want to head in that direction. The direction of the horror in general, we can see this going, in film at least, going all the way back to something like Psycho. there is a general discontent with the direction in which a character is headed. I think that there is something more primordial, less pronounced and more primordial when we're talking about that. I think that it is something which is sort of in the substrate of your mind. Changing direction is always something that causes consternation. You have to think about the general flow of life and how whenever we're switching that up, there's some risk involved with that. There is inherently risk involved with that. In sentence 2, after stating that she did not want to go to Florida, we get this. She wanted to visit some of her connections in East Tennessee, and she was seizing at every chance to change Bailey's mind. So, first off, we have mentioned here Florida and Tennessee. That tells us that with those two things being the options, we're probably looking at our characters currently being stationed someplace in the South, someplace probably in the Southeast. That orange journal is probably containing the orange journal in which he's reading about sports probably contains stories about the SEC, right? So, with the first sentence, going back to the first sentence, the last thing that the first sentence says, the grandmother. When you've got the mention of a grandmother, you have the inference of 3 separate generations: the grandmother, the middle generation, and then the grandchildren, right? So you're probably getting some tale of a family. If you have a grandmother mentioned, you're probably going to have 3 separate generations spoken of. What was I saying here? Oh, right, second sentence. She has connections in East Tennessee. What does this tell us about said grandmother? Probably she's a shady individual. What kind of person has connections? What kind of person refers to them as connections? What are connections? You're talking about something shady, right? You're not talking about somebody that is living life on the cuffs. You're talking about someone having connections. You're talking about someone who is a bit of a skeezer in themselves. And what do we have here? We have here someone trying to convince their son, their only son, to take them someplace else, thwarting the family vacation, so that what we can do is visit our connections. That is what is at play here for the grandmother. That is what the grandmother wants to do. She has personal motives in mind. So if you're here for a video about A Good Man Is Hard to Find, probably you've read it. But what happens here is that they end up coming across the misfit on the side of the road, and the misfit takes care of the family in short order. It is a tragedy. It is something where something of a horror film. We have a monster here. When you look at horror movies, for sure, what we have is the most colorful characters almost never survive. The most colorful characters doing something that might be something so selfish as trying to convince a family vacation to go someplace else so that they can have their way of things. And not doing it, she never tells him, I want to go to East Tennessee to see my connections. She simply tries to find some other direction to do this. She finds some other way to convince Bailey to take her someplace else. Sentence 3 there. Bailey was the son she lived with, her only boy. Bailey is a given name which comes from bailiff or debt collector. Bailiff means agent of the law. So we're looking at a name here, which is agent of the law or debt collector. Normally, when you have names in fiction, the name tells us something about the person whose name it is. Here, however, it's another signal that what we're going to get is a moment of reckoning. You have a reckoning with the law. You have a reckoning with your debts. When your debts are collected, you are facing that reckoning. When you are arrested, you are facing that reckoning. And it is interesting that this is the name of her son. She named her son about the law. When what happens here is an extreme case of lawlessness, thwarting a family vacation, and ending some lives, ending all of the lives, in fact. Now on to the bigger things that I want to talk about. Number one, tragedy. What is a tragedy? I have my Dictionary of Literary and Thematic Terms from Edward Quinn. The very first paragraph, the opening paragraph, of the definition of tragedy: a form of literature that depicts the downfall of the leading character whose life, its disastrous end notwithstanding, represents something significant. In this sense, tragedy may be seen as rooted in the human need to extract a value from human mortality. Viewed from this perspective, tragedy has a positive side in its search for meaning in individual life. As a result, tragedy may be less pessimistic than comedy, with the latter's more limited view of the human possibility, a fact that has become evident in recent years when the most nihilistic forms of drama are written in the comic mode. See absurd. So the tragedy. Viewed from this perspective, tragedy has a positive side in its search for meaning in individual life. What this definition is sort of outlining is that there is some morality to be taken from tragedy. Very clearly, what we have here is a tragedy. Aristotle's three elements of tragedy are all planted here within the very first paragraph, the very opening paragraph of this masterfully told short story. Now, my thick Midwestern tongue is not going to allow me to actually pronounce these words correctly. But the three elements that Aristotle outlined in tragedy: hamartia, maybe. I've only read about these things. I've never had them expressed to me in any class, so you'll have to bear with me. Anagnorisis, anagnorisis, A-N-A-G-N-O-R-I-S-I-S, and peripetia. So hamartia, is the hero's tragic flaw. Anagnorisis, the eureka moment whereby the hero realizes something about themselves to trigger change. And peripetia, the reversal of fortune, the moment the tragedy is instantiated. Now, all three of these things happen in this story. The hamartia, grandma is a schemer, right? She's a plotter, a planner. Grandma is someone with alternative motives. That is the hero's tragic flaw. We have that planted here. The grandmother did not want to go to Florida. She wanted to visit some of her connections in East Tennessee, and she was seizing every chance to try to convince her son Bailey to take her there. That's right here in the opening paragraph. We have right here in the opening paragraph the first of the three elements of tragedy, not even planted here. It's just there. The anagnorisis, the second A word, in this story, the eureka moment whereby the hero or protagonist has triggered in them some flip, some switch, basically at gunpoint, after hearing, I believe it's after hearing about the murder of the rest of her family, the grandmother tells the misfit that he is one of her own children. Now, that's not really planted here, is it? That moment where she tells the misfit that he is one of her own children. That is the moment of change for our protagonist. But all the stuff that we need to get there and have that there, have that mean something, where she ends up telling the misfit that he is one of her very own children, all of that stuff is planted here. First off, her son's name is Bailey, which means something of the law. We have the grandmother as a schemer, sort of seemingly a lawless individual, or at least giving into the temptation of lawlessness. And we have the introduction of the misfit. Now, that moment whereby the grandmother tells the misfit he's one of her own children is a eureka moment, because it's under duress and she's really not thinking clearly at the moment. But what it becomes is a recognition that the misfit, the murderous one, is more akin to my character than my own son, who has his flourishing little family and his 2 children that he loves. It is the adoption of the misfit, the proclamation that they are kin. That is only possible with the elements that are given to us in the opening paragraph. Especially when you are considering the fact that in this very opening paragraph, the grandmother's character is so flawed that she is attempting to convince her son of something extremely selfish right here in the opening. She is treating her son, lying to him as if he were not her kin. Peripetia, the reversal. I'm sure someone knows how these things are pronounced and is absolutely roasting me right now. But peripetia, the reversal of fortune, the moment the tragedy is instantiated. It is the grandmother, when the family pulls over to help these people on the side of the road, the grandmother thinks he looks familiar. The head guy there, the leader of this group of people, she thinks he looks awfully familiar. The moment tragedy is guaranteed is the moment the grandmother blurts out, "You're the misfit." She, now probably with the type of individual that the misfit is characterized, probably he was going to kill them all anyway, right? At that point, he has no choice. At this point, when the grandmother says, "You're the misfit has no choice but to kill them. He is, after all, escaped from the penitentiary. We have here planted, "Here is this fellow that calls himself the misfit, is a loose from the federal pen and headed toward Florida. And you read here what it says he did to these people. Just you read it. I wouldn't take my children in any direction with a criminal like that a loose in it. I couldn't answer to my conscience if I did." Everything that happens at that point is foreshadowed here in the opening paragraph. So, I mean, what is this opening paragraph? Maybe 120 words, 125, 150 words tops. I don't think it's even that long. And we have all of that. We have all the three elements of tragedy buried directly in this first paragraph, these first few sentences of this story. That is, in my estimate, part of the genius that's at play here, because of the second thing that we're going to talk about. There's two things, two large thematic devices, large thematic tomes planted right here in this opening paragraph. The second massive deal here is that Flannery O'Connor is... I have a little bit of experience with Flannery O'Connor, and I can tell you that one thing you're going to find in Flannery O'Connor is a Southern Gothic. And I have pulled up here South Coast Repertory, Elements of a Southern Gothic. This is according to this website, but it's a pretty good list. It's a list of 11 elements that are found in Southern Gothic, and the list reads as such. Voodoo and spirituality, an air of mystery and or the supernatural. Grotesque history, especially focusing on the South's history of slavery. Social anxieties represented in racial tension. Deeply flawed, disturbing, or eccentric characters. A sense of moral and physical decay, especially decaying buildings and plantation homes. Darkened religious symbols. Exploring madness. Heat that can be stifling and or liberating. Swamps or rivers. Sinister events relating to or stemming from poverty, alienation, crime, or violence. I am here to tell you that every one of these 11 elements is here in this short story, including, so there's always, when you're talking about large ideas like this, there's always little parts that I will forget from time to time. This idea of, where are we here? Social anxieties represented in racial tension. That's one of the elements that is separate from grotesque history, especially focusing on the South's history with slavery. Those two things are separate. Those two things are not interchangeable. And the first one, the South's history of slavery, I always remember that being an element of Southern Gothic. Racial tensions, it often slips my mind because I relate the things so closely. The racial tensions are represented in this short story, despite the fact that those racial tensions have nothing to do with the short story. That is how closely Flannery O'Connor's stories follow by the Southern Gothic rule book. But here we have, in this opening paragraph, 5 of the 11 elements present. Voodoo and spirituality / an air of mystery and the supernatural. The idea of culpability and having to answer for one's conscience. This is a spiritual idea. This is an idea about the supernatural. It might not seem to be so, but it absolutely is. There is nothing measurable about your conscience. There is nothing... If a person decided to take their family to Florida and somehow ran across the one individual that they had somehow read about in the newspaper that day, that is a supernatural type of thing. The odds of that happening are so minuscule that their exploitation would be seen as supernatural, right? So one way that we can conceptualize this is to think about all of the times where someone says something like, I was thinking about my great aunt, and that song about the guy losing his aunt came on the radio. it had to be a sign from God. This is just a small coincidence. It is it is a minuscule chance that such a thing would happen. So when it does happen, we chalk it up to being something paranormal. That happens here. She tries to convince him not to go to Florida in case they would run across that person, because your conscience couldn't deal with it. The next element, which is absolutely present here from that checklist of 11 things, deeply flawed, disturbing, or eccentric characters. The misfit, once we meet him and his couple buddies, they are certainly deeply flawed and they are certainly disturbing. But grandma here is both flawed and eccentric. You start reading this story and she's a real bugger, right? We start to get to know her a little bit more through the 11 pages or so, probably, of this short story. And we understand that this is not your run-of-the-mill character. This is not someone you would find in Hemingway. This is not someone you would probably find in Fitzgerald. It's someone you find in Flannery O'Connor, because Flannery O'Connor wrote Southern Gothics. A sense of moral and physical decay. The moral decay that is present in this short story. Number one, Grandma's lying to her son. Number two, Bailey is apparently, purportedly, by the words of Grandma, doing something that Grandma would not. She would not find it conscionable to take her family in the direction that the misfit is currently presiding. The misfit obviously is not acting under standard moral obligations, although he does sort of try to speak as if he is. He tries to speak as if you ever watch Chael Sonnen, he talks about the bad guy having a code. The bad guy has his own code. The misfit has his own code, or says he does. The misfit escaping in itself is a sign of sort of physical decay. The misfit would not have escaped from a fully functioning penitentiary. The fact that he was able, in fact, to escape says something like, well, that place has probably fallen apart. At some level, it is not, at any rate, functioning perfectly. The next element, exploring madness. So this is actually not quite represented in this opening paragraph. It is instead foreshadowed. The mention of madness, the mention of something dastardly, this misfit fella and what it is he's doing to people, that's mentioned here. It is not the exploration of madness, however. So the reason, sort of, we can see, but the reason I really want to talk about this here is the fact that once we understand we're in a Southern Gothic, we are better able to forecast and understand foreshadowing. Knowing that we are in a Southern Gothic, what we can do is be looking for the clues about madness herein. What we can do is understanding that we will get some exploration of madness. We are able to pick what it is. Okay, let me take a step back. We do, in fact, get an exploration of madness once we meet the misfit. We get his reasoning for all of the things that he does. That's an exploration of madness. The exploration of madness that we get here sort of exploits religiosity. But the important thing, the reason I want to talk about this here, is that once we know we are in a Southern Gothic, we understand that there will be some exploration of madness. Knowing that there will be some exploration of madness, we are left to look for it. If the misfit did not give his interpretation of what madness is, or not his interpretation of what madness is, his did not act out his role as a madman, we would have to put something else in that role. Knowing that we would have to put something else in that role, there might be some other individual giving an interpretation of their interpretation of the world as he or she sees it. We would be left with that to interpret as madness, and we would be able to then sort of play with what that idea is and whether or not it might be madness. So if the only thing that people are representing in here are mundane views of the world, that could be the author communicating with us that the mundane view of the world is in fact a crazy way to look at things. The last thing here, sinister events relating to or stemming from poverty, alienation, crime, or violence. We have no reason to, well, the misfit is a label that suggests one is alienated, but Grandma is also alienated. Here she is, seemingly something of a prisoner in her own family and living circumstance. Crime and violence, the things here, sinister events, obviously those things happen. Those things happen in a raw and naked fashion in this short story. So, well, but I guess that's not the opening paragraph that I'm talking about there. But we have the mention of those terrible things that the misfit is doing. The misfit, being labeled the misfit, is alienated. And we have it already pointed out here in the opening paragraph that he's doing terrible things to people. So that is all that I have for this. The opening paragraph of A Good Man is Hard to Find. If you have not read any Flannery O'Connor, I cannot speak highly enough about Flannery O'Connor. This is another video in a playlist here on the channel of opening paragraphs. So if you found this interesting, maybe check out that playlist. But it's also a short story that I have done a review for on the channel, and I'll probably do several more videos on this short story because it's so good. But yeah, that's all I have. I hope to see you next time for our next video.